what I thought I'd do this evening is, the theme is playing with matches, and I was casting back to various sort of dangerous things I've done, and I thought the theme of this would be an experience of mine that I had when I was about 17, so 52 years ago, and it's about the unwise decision to let 17-year-olds play with extremely sharp knives. This is what happened. It was in 1962, the summer, and I had left school and I was taking, as many British children do, a year off before going up to university. And I attended a science fair in London, and there met a petite and rather beautiful young woman from Canada. And the two of us, it sounds incredibly nerdy at this remove, we built somewhere in High Holborn or Bloomsbury a hydroponic tomato, or tomato as you would say, production system. And in the process of doing this, fell head over heels for one another in the way that 17-year-olds do. And she went back to Canada, and I vowed that I would do everything in my power to go and see her. She lived in Montreal, in a place called Verdun, a suburb of Montreal, which I'm sure Adam Gopnik knows very well. I didn't much want to go by aeroplane, but because my father used to take me, we lived north of London, and he would, as a treat, take me into central London, Trafalgar Square and Pall Mall and so forth. And we spent a lot of time looking at the amazing models of ships in the offices of P&O and Cunard and Canadian Pacific. And I thought if I was going to cross the Atlantic, I would cross the Atlantic on a ship. And so I went, as I had to go to Montreal, to the Canadian Pacific office, and there was a clerk with a pince-nez and I fancy a quill in his hand. And I said, with all the sort of nervousness of a young schoolboy, how much does it cost to go by one of your marvelous ships, the Empress of Britain or the Empress of Canada, to Montreal? And he quoted a figure which was, for me, stratospheric and impossible, about £100, which in those days was a great deal of money. So I resolved that I had to get a job which would pay me £100 as quickly as possible. Well, in those days, there were two London newspapers, the Evening News and the Evening Standard, and they had something which has almost totally disappeared from newspapers these days, classified ads, if you remember them, small ads. And I was looking through the Evening News one afternoon, and I saw something which seemed to me to offer me the possibility of earning a great deal of money. It said, mortuary assistant, Whittington Hospital, £11 a week, which was a great deal of money in those days. Knowledge of basic anatomy preferred, but not essential. So it didn't seem sort of Himalayan, the bar to entry. So I had been at school, I had taken, because I was going off to read for a science degree at Oxford, I had taken zoology at A-level, and under my biology teacher, Mr. Hawthorne, I remember, we had dissected every known creature from Amphioxus to zebra, well, perhaps not zebra, but lots of mammals anyway. There was obviously cockroaches and dogfishes, but also rabbits. And of course, when you think a rabbit is, or a human being is really just an enormous rabbit, minus the ears and the tail. So I figured I could possibly manage this. So I rang the mortuary department and spoke to a chap who said his name was Mr. Utton. And he said, I'm so pleased to hear from you. And I said, why? He said, well, because this advertisement has been running for the last week and no one has applied for this job. He said, rather darkly, I put it down to necrophobia. And he said, are you afraid of dead bodies? And I said, no, I don't think so. He said, well, please come to the Whittington Hospital. And I knew the Whittington, which is a great sort of Victorian mausoleum on the Archway Road. At the bottom of it, there's a graveyard, perhaps somewhat ominously, where Karl Marx is buried. And I used to, remember my school used to go and visit. So anyway, I went to the mortuary and met this Mr. Utton, who was a very genial man with a club foot, I remember. And he introduced me to the two members of staff, the pathologist, the person who would actually do the post-mortems. She was a German lady, and arrestingly, her name was Dr. Fleischhacker, which, as you'll probably realize, means butcher, so it seemed most appropriate. And then there was the tea lady, who was elderly, had no teeth, dribbled a great deal, and had a voluminous moustache. So this was the team that I was going to be joining, very much the A team. And I got the job without further ado because I was the only applicant. And Mr. Utton and I went down and sat on Karl Marx's tomb and ate cheese sandwiches. And he told me about his fascination with crosswords and how his name, Utton, came about because his father was called Hutton, but the person who filled in the birth certificate was deaf, and so they omitted the H mysteriously. And he said, and Dr. Fleischhacker will conduct the autopsies and you will prepare the bodies. And I said, what exactly do you mean by prepare the bodies? And he said, oh, you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. And so then I went home and told my mother, and she was thrilled because she said, you'll presumably bring me lots of flowers, because whenever there are dead people, there are lots of flowers. So I said I would do my level best to bring her flowers each evening. And so I started the job. I turned up on a Monday morning, and the freezer was full of dead people. And I mean, I won't go into too graphic detail of what I did, but basically, if you accept the basic premise that Dr. Fleischhacker investigated the insides of the people, then I was the chap that opened the doors that allowed her to do that. And so it involved a lot of sharp knives and a lot of snipping of ribs and things. And then, okay, well, I'm so sorry, but delicious, yes, jolly good dinner, I hope. One thing which is quite interesting, which is slightly gruesome, it is very gruesome, in fact, but I hope you'll deal with it. Don't hold back, all right, okay. Is that an awful lot of these people were elderly and died from sort of bronchial ailments of one sort or another, and they smoked very heavily. And you could tell this because when you opened up the rib cage, their lungs they looked rather like very large prunes. And you'd take them out and you'd weigh them, and they'd weigh, a lung full of nicotine weighs about 4 pounds. But then you'd take the lung and wash it under a running tap, and after about 15 minutes, it becomes its original pink and fluffy and light state, probably weighing about 6 ounces. So you had to make a note of this. And when you realized that a lifetime of smoking meant that each lung contained 3.5 pounds of tar and nicotine, there's sort of no wonder why this chap survived or died as quickly as he did. In addition to that, and this greatly enhanced my income, was that this was the days in the 1960s of London fogs, the smogs. I remember I caught the 134 bus home, and often the fog was so thick and yellow, a great miasma, that a policeman with a torch had to walk in front of the bus so that the bus driver could see his way through the gloom. Well, the effect of this was that people died like flies. I mean, and I went in one Monday morning, and there were 30 bodies waiting for me to deal with, which for me was because they paid a per-body bonus in addition to the 11 pounds meant, if you remember pounds, shillings and pence, 30 bodies times 4, it's an extra 6 pounds, and of course heaps and heaps of flowers for my mother. So, but the point of this story was about 4 weeks into I got fairly accustomed to the routine of opening up the bodies and then doing after Dr. Fleischhacker and she incidentally smoked herself furiously and would stuff, yes, she did, yeah. She used the chest cavity as an ashtray. I hope this isn't ruining your evening. I'm so sorry if it is. So anyway, a chap jumped the shark, yes, Clive. I came in one Monday morning, and there was a chap in the fridge, neatly dressed, without shoes and socks on, and he had a tag on his toe big sort of cardboard thing saying, query, leukemia. Now, I didn't quite know what to do with this, so I looked up and there's a manual, and Mr. Utton, who clearly had a thing for the lady with the moustache and the no teeth and the dribbling, was off having breakfast with her or something. So I was left alone with this man, and the dead man, that is. And I looked up in the manual, you know, what to do with if you find a gunshot wound, or what you do if you find a suppurating, you know, disease, looks as if it's infectious. But leukemia was quite simple. It said remove the femur and send it up to the laboratory for testing. So I did all the other stuff and then took this chap's trousers off and made an incision between his pelvis and his knee and wrenched this big bone out and washed it and sent it up to the path lab. And then did all the rest of it, and then, it's tremendous, and then dressed him, and his leg kept flopping off the table. No matter what I did, I would prop it up neatly, but it would just... And then the undertaker came round to take away the body, and he said, why is his leg flopping off the table? I said, his name was Sid. He was a very nasty man with very colourful language. And I said, I don't know, Sid, I had to take one of his bones out, and his leg keeps flopping off the table. He said, well, I can't take this leg. He says, I can't take this body. I can't sign for it in that condition. I said, well, what am I to do? He said, well, you've got to find something to put in his fucking leg, you know. So I said, what? He said, well, it's not my job to tell you. He said, but I'll tell you what. He says, I'll go and have me dinner, and I'll come back at 2 o'clock, and I'll expect you to have found something to stiffen up the leg, and then everything will be okay. So he left me with this sort of legless, half-naked man, and I looked in the backyard of a Victorian hospital. Is a pretty unattractive place with sort of rats and puddles and things, but I found a piece of drain pipe about 18 inches long. And I had a skill saw, which I used when I had to take off people's craniums. And I used it to saw it to 14 inches, which was the length from his patella to his pelvis. And I undid the blanket stitch, and I put it in, and the leg shot out like a ramrod. It was just tremendous. And I sewed him up again, pulled his trousers on, put his suit jacket on, and just in time, and Sid, now smelling somewhat of the beer he had had for lunch, came back and he said, that's marvellous, that's wonderful. I don't know what you've done, mate, but that's brilliant. Signed for the body, backed the Daimler up to the loading bay and put the fellow in the coffin, and that was that. At least I thought that was that. The next day, Mr. Utton was in his office and the phone rang, and I heard this enraged tone gathering as Mr. Utton was dealing with someone at the other end. And he put down the phone and he came up to me and he said, there's a problem. I said, why? He said, you remember that fellow that you put his leg yesterday? I said, yes, yes. Well, he wasn't buried, he said. He was cremated. And you can see the scene. He described it impeccably, the grieving relatives, the curtain closing, the coffin disappearing into the flame, everyone thanking the vicar, looking at the flowers, and then suddenly from the back you hear a clunk and engineers saying things like, what's that? And it was 14 inches of red-hot galvanized iron drain pipe. And mercifully, one of the uncles, there was talks of lawsuits and things like that, but he said, oh, George, he said, I never knew he had it in him. And Mr. Utton took me by my earlobe and led me to a cupboard and opened it, and there was a sort of a basket with like a quiver with about 20 chair legs. He said, white pine, next time you get a chap with leukemia, put one of those in his leg and it burns to nothing in a microsecond. So playing with fire, don't yet let youngsters, 17-year-olds anyway, have access to sharp knives. Let that be a warning to you all. Thank you very much indeed.